Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Growing more with less is the mantra of Nebraska's corn farmers, and they're using incredible technology to do it. Soil moisture monitors let them know when their crop needs water and how much. GPS systems eliminate overlaps in the field, saving fuel and money. New hybrids reduce the use of pesticides and increase yields. When you're talking new technology and innovation, Nebraska corn farmers are all ears. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Bryce Stewskin. On this episode, Roy Smith discusses corn and soybean markets. Brad Lubben talks about proposed Farm Bill policies. Aaron Berger explains the recent impacts of cold weather on cow-calf production. And Roger Reed shares information on ethanol. Roy Smith is our market analyst this week. The U.S. Department of Agriculture latest crop progress report was issued on Monday. Cold and snowy weather kept producers out of the fields as only 3% of the U.S. corn crop was planted last week. The U.S. estimate is up just 1 percentage point from the week prior and is behind the 5-year average of 5%. For Nebraska, farmers have planted an estimated 1% of the corn crop, which is behind the 5-year average of 2% during this time of the year. Due to the continued cold weather, some traders now wonder if the markets will notice the crop progress slipping behind. We spoke with Roy Tuesday afternoon and began by asking him about the recent reports.
It's always interesting this time of year to look at those markets and look at the analysts and what they have to say. You always hear some of the analysts talking about, well, this bunch of farmers planted this much, and this plant in this part of the state they planted that much, when in reality the numbers are so small and the effect is so marginal that it really doesn't matter. Farmers are going to plant what they plant, and that'll probably always be that way because some farmers have a liking for corn and some farmers have a liking for beans, and when all is said and done, it's going to be 50-50 probably.
One of the things you talk about this time of year is selling new crop and old crop as we go through April and into May. Tell us why that is.
Well, my theory is that certain times of the year you need to be taking action, and certain times of the year you need to avoid taking action. And here we are around the 1st of April to the 1st of May, and we've seen soybeans rally like 50 cents a bushel. And if you're waiting for a rally in either the corn or soybean market, here it is. Don't waste it by not doing anything.
We do see some of those long-term charts showing exactly what you were saying. When it comes to percentage that somebody should be considering that new crop and old crop as we move through these months, how much would you recommend?
Well, to be honest with you, I don't really recommend anything. But secondly, it really depends on your cash flow and what works in with your crop rotations. And in Nebraska, at least in the eastern part of Nebraska, those crop rotations are a very important factor because frankly, most farmers plant what they're expected to plant. So you might have somebody in Cass County, like we are now, that would plant 50% of corn and 50% of soybeans. And if you go to North Platte or Ogallala or somewhere like that, they're probably looking at 10% soybeans and 40% corn. So there's a whole lot of factors in there that are really interesting, but they don't amount to much.
You and I are standing here in Coates in the middle of April. Does the weather get to be a concern for you when you look at the way the markets react to that as well?
Well, does it become a factor? No, my perception is that everybody thinks it's a factor, but it really isn't. When all's said and done, how the crop progressed through the growing season is a lot more important than how much of each one of those crops are raised.
We'll get back to weather here in a moment. One of the things you like to say is always forward contract corn specifically on May 1st. Tell us why that is.
Well, it's pretty simple. Year in and year out, the 1st of May has been a good time to sell corn. My theory that I've developed over the years is you should be forward contracting corn. Some corn, how much, you know, that's up to the manager. But for soybeans, you never sell soybeans in February, because year in and year out that has never been the highest price of the year. So if you're looking for selling soybeans, do it sooner or later, but don't do it in February.
What are the big things you want people to be looking at constantly as we continue through April and then into May?
Well, it's pretty easy to look at a chart and say, well, you should have planted so many acres of corn, you should have planted so many acres of soybeans. But really what I prefer farmers to do is base their planting intentions on the crop that you've just put in the ground. You know you're going to harvest it, at least you hope you know you're going to harvest it, so that has to be a factor. Having the right balance, so to speak, that has to be a factor. But in reality, the big thing is what are the markets going to do in July and August, when the weather really will have an effect on them. And you would hope that some people, most people, have some forward contracted. They got bin space for some, and they need to be basing their realistic expectations on those factors.
Next week, Mike Briggs will join us to provide his analysis of the cattle markets. The House Agriculture Committee has revealed the first version of the 2018 Farm Bill. The bill is estimated to spend about $867 billion over the next 10 years. According to Brad Lubben, a Nebraska Extension policy specialist, the proposed language reauthorized PLC and ARC-CO and increased the Conservation Reserve Program, also known as the CRP acreage cap. However, Brad notes that nutrition is the most contentious title. House Republicans recently added language that would require most adults in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program to enroll in a state workforce program or work at least part-time to receive benefits. We spoke with Brad Wednesday morning and began by asking him about the changes in the proposed 2018 Farm Bill for commodities.
Well, what we see released and what we expect to see debated here as the House Ag Committee brings up the initial deliberations. On the commodity program itself, is fundamentally no major change, at least no major change from what was expected. Some tweaks to the ARC program in terms of the yield data used for the calculations. It looks like a projected elimination of the individual coverage portion of the ARC plan, which wasn't widely used in the first place. But fundamentally a commodity program that looks very much like what we have today.
On the conservation side, we'll see an increase in CRP acres.
Right.
Tell us about that and other changes on conservation.
Yeah. Two big items in the conservation plan. Of course, remembering this is just a proposal going forward at this point, but a proposal to increase the CRP acreage, the cap from 24 million eventually up to 29 million. So a modest expansion of CRP, 1 million new acres every year, but also a reduction in payment rates, that is the rental rate on CRP acres. A proposal to cut that to 80% of the going county average rental rate instead of the current 100%. That would help save some money. That would help pay for the increased acreage. The other big item mentioned in the conservation section is the proposed merger of EQIP and CSP. By definition, it's an elimination of the CSP program going forward, but an addition of stewardship payments into the EQIP program as currently defined. Now, that might be a way to merge the two fundamental working lands programs into one and maybe streamline some activities. It also faces a lot of pressure from current participants and stakeholders who like the direction of the CSP program. So while it looks like it's going forward, at least in the House Ag Committee discussions, that will be another area we'll watch and see what further deliberations bring.
Let's talk more about crop insurance. Sometimes no news is good news.
So far, one would say that crop insurance, really, expectations are that both committees in the House and the Senate, that both ag committees would strongly support existing crop insurance programs, and we don't see any changes coming there. We do expect, and everybody I think is generally waiting for and watching for what might be proposed on the floor. Maybe from the far left, maybe from the far right, but from both ends of the spectrum, maybe proposed amendments coming that could take cuts at crop insurance as we currently see it.
One addition this year has to do with an animal vaccine bank.
We've seen ag groups, livestock groups particularly, talk about the need for a vaccine bank to get the United States prepared for a potential animal disease issue and the ability to respond quickly. Building a vaccine bank, putting in a strategy of preparedness instead of response has been critical to them. It's proposed to add several $100 million in the House Farm Bill language to do just that. Again, we'll have to watch this unfold in the House Ag Committee, the Senate Ag Committee, and eventually any sort of final legislation. But there clearly is some strong effort to address the animal disease issue with a strategy of preparedness.
The nutrition title is drawing the most criticism in this first early version. Tell us about why that is.
In the whole debate, and we remember that farm bills now for 40+ years have been farm and food, and the nutrition title is clearly the biggest title in terms of spending. It's also become, this go round, the single biggest point of debate and contention, and it's arguably the reason why the farm bill's fate is uncertain right now. The nutrition title funds predominantly SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and that SNAP program itself is subject to substantial debate. There are proposals to tighten some of the eligibility restrictions and some of the rules to try and tighten up participation rates and reduce current enrollment. There are also proposals in this House Ag version markup language to substantially increase the spending on training and other incentive programs to help motivate job and educational efforts for those that are currently on assistance. Now, interestingly enough, the proposal as presented is basically a budget neutral bill. All the proposed savings due to eligibility rules or participation rates are reinvested into some of these training and incentive efforts. And yet we still see a very strong Republican versus Democratic divide on what the fate of the nutrition title looks like. That may not prevent or seriously hamper the progress of the bill moving through committee, where there are still enough Republican votes to pass it if everybody votes, but it could seriously affect the fate of the bill on the floor, and it could substantially change when you look at what a bipartisan Senate bill might look like.
Following the markup process on Wednesday, the Farm Bill was voted out of the U.S. House Ag Committee to the full House floor. The second week of April brought freezing temperatures, snow, and wind across parts of the High Plains. According to Aaron Berger, a Nebraska Extension educator, cold and wet spring weather conditions can have impacts on livestock by increasing the possibility of hypothermia. In addition, Aaron explains how producers may have to delay pasture turnouts due to the fewer growing degree days recorded this year. We spoke with Aaron Wednesday morning and began by asking him how the April blizzard will affect cow-calf production.
So storms like we had with the blizzard last week are certainly a challenge for livestock producers, specifically thinking about cow-calf producers right now who would be calving. Those kind of wet, cold conditions are really challenging, especially for a newborn calf. So for cattle producers, protection obviously is pretty important around calving cows, providing wind protection for the cows in general, and trying to get those cattle as much as they can out of the weather, or at least mitigate some of the effects of the weather is pretty important with a storm like that.
Let's talk more about some of those steps that livestock producers can take to prepare for some of this adverse weather.
So obviously conditions like this, we do have the benefit of the time we live to have some warning that these kind of events are coming. So getting cattle closer to protection, providing them some high quality forage or feed prior to the storm, having some auxiliary power in place, especially for water sources for cattle that are in pens, is going to be important if we are without power for a few days. So those are some things that we can do to prepare. Again, getting those cattle in behind wind protection, especially with a blizzard type event, can really be helpful to keep those cattle from drifting, and having them in a place where we can get to them and get feed to them with those kind of weather events.
Specifically for forages and perennials, how does this late snow affect them?
So really the cold temperatures are going to provide some challenges for us a little bit as we go into the spring. I was visiting with Dr. Jerry Valesky, who's at the West Central Research and Extension Center earlier this week. He told me that as of April 15th, they've been tracking growing degree days. They're in the low 60s in terms of percent of growing degree days as compared to the long-term average. So that's going to provide some challenges for folks who've been depending on winter annuals, also planting some spring annuals for forage. I think it's also going to probably challenge us a little bit in that we may need to plan for some delayed turnout on some things like smooth brome and perennial native range pastures that are predominantly cool season. Just because of the cool temperatures, we're not going to see as much forage production from those based on a traditional calendar date as we normally would.
Aaron, you noted that it could be important to supply mineral this time of year before and after letting them out on some of those forages and perennials.
So as we think about these cool season annual forages and also perennial forages, cool, cloudy, damp conditions can trigger an event called grass tetany, especially in cattle that are lactating. And so providing mineral that's got adequate magnesium as well as calcium as we turn out on these pastures is important. Would like to see that being supplied approximately 30 to 45 days ahead of time. We also may need to provide some additional hay out on some of these cool season annuals or even some perennial pastures, just because we're going to have some high quality there, but we're not going to have very much quantity. And so providing some additional energy may be important as we put cattle out on pasture this spring.
These weather events can cause some stress on livestock as well. Talk about the different kinds of stress and how you can adjust for that.
So I think we need to understand that when we have a spring wet storm like this, we actually can have more hypothermia exposure than we would if we think about a January day when it's 10 degrees outside. For cattle that have a winter hair coat, if it's cold and dry, their normal critical body temperature, the point at which they really need to start using energy to maintain their body temperature, is around 20 degrees Fahrenheit. However, when they're wet, like a condition we had last week, that lower critical temperature becomes closer to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So we actually can have more cold stress from an event in a blizzard like we had last week, where we had rain followed by snow. Those wet conditions with wind can really provide a lot of stress, cold stress, to that animal, which is something we don't normally think about with the spring storm, but certainly is a situation we need to be aware of. So minimizing wind chill effect, especially in a spring storm like that, can really help to minimize stress on cattle.
On the eastern side of the state of Nebraska, we're seeing some of the pastures begin to green up. Give us an update on the western side, what you're seeing in your pastures.
So on the west side, we're starting to see a tinge of green, but I would say we're behind maybe average in terms of what we would normally see. We've seen some really cool temperatures, and so while we're starting to get a tinge of color, we're really not growing much, and I think that's probably pretty much true across the state. So planning on some delayed turnout, I think, is really going to probably need to be something that people think through. Normal turnout date is probably not going to have adequate forage available for cattle to graze in many parts of the state this spring.
You can learn more about beef cattle production and management by going to beef.unl.edu. Data from the 2012 Census of Agriculture shows that Nebraska leads the nation in total irrigated acres. Even with 8.3 million acres irrigated across the state, only a fraction of the state's wheat crop is irrigated. Most of those irrigated wheat crop fields are found in the western region of Nebraska. As irrigation continues to be a key aspect of agriculture, it is important to remember a few unique management skills in order to raise irrigated wheat. You can learn about these management practices and considerations in the April Nebraska Farmer. According to North Dakota State University, today's ethanol industry as we know it began in the 1970s as petroleum-based fuel became expensive. In addition, corn became the most commonly used feedstock for ethanol production due to its abundance and ability to be transformed into alcohol. Since 2005, the demand for ethanol has increased. Public policy has worked to decrease the dependence on imported oil, along with providing a more environmentally friendly fuel, such as ethanol. We recently talked with Roger Reed, Senior Equity Research Analyst at Wells Fargo Securities, to learn more about ethanol production.
So the renewable fuel standard was set up for a couple of reasons. You go all the way back to the 70s for one of the last oil crises, and then obviously the one that happened in the prior decade. And the real idea here was U.S. oil production was in terminal decline, gasoline consumption was in terminal incline, and we could come up with a combination of corn-based fuels and future biofuels that were going to solve some of our problems and reduce our dependence on parts of the world that, you know, are less than dependable from time to time. Today with the RFS, some changes occurred that people didn't plan on. One is oil supply increased in the U.S., gasoline demand flatlined, and we never came up with some of the cellulosic fuels. So it's a little different environment today than what was originally, you know, intended or understood when they laid out the RFS.
We further asked Roger about RINs, also known as Renewable Identification Numbers, and how they impact the ethanol industry.
Quick story on a RIN is, in order to encourage the industry to add ethanol, you put originally a mandate out. But the mandate was just sort of numbers on a line. We ultimately recognized, or the people who wrote the RFS ultimately recognized, at some point you're going to get pushback on that. And so the RIN was essentially an added cost that if you didn't blend, you were going to pay the price of the RIN. And the idea being that it would always be ultimately cheaper to blend than to pay the RIN. The problem we've run into in the last several years is we've essentially hit what is called the blend wall, meaning you're at sort of a maximum blend level for a number of other rules that are out there in the fuel sector. And so the RIN has become a cost, but it is no longer really delivering a benefit in the sense of greater blends of ethanol. We describe it as sort of diminishing returns, which is not surprising from an economic standpoint.
On April 12th, President Donald Trump announced that his administration may allow the usage of gasoline containing 15% ethanol year-round to potentially help farmers increase corn demand.
There's a lot of reasons for thinking that E15, E20, higher blends ultimately will come into the market. When the RFS was written in 2007, Congress gave a waiver to an E10 blend without getting too technical, essentially what its emissions are allowed to be. While the emissions are actually technically a little bit lower with E15, Congress did not grant a waiver for E15. So the question really being asked is, does the administrative side, the EPA, have the authority to go to E15? Does it require an act of Congress? I guarantee you whatever the Trump administration decides is going to get litigated to ultimately determine that, and it may, in the end, require an act of Congress.
According to Roger, there are benefits of using higher octane fuels. However, ethanol still has some emissions issues.
Yeah, so the higher octane helps in terms of getting higher fuel economy, and if you get more miles per gallon, then you're obviously reducing your usage of energy. The pushback you're going to get is that RVP, the reed vapor pressure, which has to do with the evaporative issues. It's like a lot of things in life, there's a win, there's a loss, there's a gain, there's a step backwards. So I wouldn't look at it as, ethanol is the magical fuel, but I think there's a pretty reasonable case to be made given its octane, given where the fuel specifications are going to likely go over the next 5, 10, and 15 years, that it should be a component of the solution of how we get from A to B.
Now with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly forecast. And during this last week, of course, we dealt with last weekend's major snowstorm across much of the upper Midwest. Heaviest snowfall totals occurred in the Panhandle Southwest up through northeast Nebraska. Northeast Nebraska was the big winner in terms of total accumulated precipitation during this last 7 days because of the second system that came out during the midweek period, dropped another 2 to 7 inches in northeast Nebraska. So we have a couple stations that were in the 22 to 27 inch range in terms of total weekly snowfall accumulations. A lot of that snow will disappear. What hasn't disappeared will disappear this weekend, but more importantly, we'll start to see some of that heavier snowfall disappear to the areas to the northeast of us, although soil conditions are going to be very saturated, at least in the short term. And hopefully with this warmer weather moving in, projected by the models, and a drying trend, we'll start to see activity in terms of planting pick up in earnest as we go to the following week. Now, the farther south you go, of course, the situation is much more dire. We've had a lot of rangeland fires down in Oklahoma, Texas, and southeastern Colorado. Last Thursday alone, over 400,000 acres burned in Oklahoma. So a very critical situation to the southern plains, and there is a system moving through presently that may at least give them a little temporary shot of moisture. So as we go to the upper air models, we'll kind of see how this is going to play out. Here's that upper air trough responsible for that moisture. It kind of slid toward the southeast out of the central Rockies, intensifying as it got over eastern Oklahoma, Texas. And so at the surface, we have high pressure trying to build in. There's not really shown the low pressure system under this area of upper air low, but we do have a widespread area of convection and some moisture up toward the northwest into the southwest part of the state. By tomorrow, this system is expected to slide basically about 200 miles to the east, low pressure sitting over Alabama, Mississippi, generating a large widespread area of heavy convective activity, probably looking 2 to 3 inches in this region for the 24-hour period. And then that system, as we get into the day on Monday, starts to slide a little bit farther toward the east. That's going to move the surface low over southern Georgia, and a lot of Gulf moisture and Atlantic moisture will be brought into this system, generating a widespread shield of moisture through the mid-Atlantic region, heavy precipitation, and another wave starts to move across the northern plains, generating precipitation in the north central Rockies. At the surface, we start to see high pressure moving into our region, and we see a low pressure system basically generating itself over Illinois. So the precipitation shield will start to move across the Dakotas, maybe touching northeast Nebraska, a lot lighter amounts to the south of Interstate 80. And then on Wednesday, this trough starts to lift up toward the northeast, surface low now over the northeastern United States, so the heavy precipitation shield starts to move up the eastern seaboard. Do show low pressure over Texas, but you can see not much in the way of any moisture associated with it. And by the time we get to Thursday, we really start to see the heat build into our region. We'll be looking at widespread 70s across the western part of the state, probably moving in the eastern part of the state, with low pressure systems shown over in southwestern portions of Oklahoma, but there's just no moisture with this system to work with, so very light shower activity projected. And then by Friday, we do see the signs of a trough trying to dig into the northeastern United States and the Great Lakes. It will not have any impact on Nebraska as we stay under the influence of high pressure to our west. This presents a very excellent opportunity for good planting weather, as we should see our soil temperatures move up above that critical 50-degree mark over this next 7-day period. And as we look out even farther, next Thursday to the following Tuesday, the cool weather shoves itself to the east. We have warmth still continuing to build its way from the west into our region. And in terms of precipitation, dry across the northern plains with above normal moisture projected for the southern plains, although once again, I really believe this is overdone because of such dry conditions at the surface.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean markets, the proposed farm bill, how cold and wet spring weather conditions can impact cow-calf production, and ethanol discussions. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Next week, Mike Briggs will be our cattle market analyst. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Bryce Duskett. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.